The scariest experience I ever had in a forest was when I was about 12 years old. My parents owned about 6 acres of forest and 6 acres of garden, cleared area. One afternoon we had already picked all the garden veggies that we had to, and I was allowed to do what I wanted since we were all through with the work for the day. I proceeded to take a walk down into the forest. There was a clearing of some sort that my dad had made to drive down into the forest, but it could only be accessed by a 4-wheel drive since there were lots of little stumps and bushes. This forest was pretty much untouched woods. We had previously had to bury my little pet Chihuahua due to her getting very sick and passing away some weeks before this particular day, and I wanted to visit her grave. We had buried her way back at the very back of the property and made here a little grave that we could visit if we wanted to, and this was a pretty day, so I decided to go visit my little canine friend's grave, alone. I went all by myself. I stayed a few minutes and said few words and left. As I was starting my way back through the 6 acres of woods, not having any fear at all, I started feeling like I was being watched, a very strong sense that I was being observed by someone or something. I stopped and looked around, but I didn't see anything that looked out of the ordinary. Actually, everything was eerily quiet. Something in my extrasensory part of my brain told me to run and run as fast as I could, or I may never make it out of those woods. I started to run, but I tried to just run normally and not make it look like I was panicking, but inside I was panicking. I kept turning and looking over my shoulder and didn't stop. I felt like I was being pursued, but at that point I just booked it out of there. Thankfully I made it to the clearing in safety of where my parents were. I knew I was safe then at that point. I started to think that maybe it had all been in my head and I overacted. I mean, I had been in those woods countless times exploring without any fear ever. Later on that evening we heard on the news that a dangerous escaped convict was on the loose. Can you guess where? He was in the woods where I was. That was where authorities had pinpointed him, and at the time I was in the very section of woods where he was. I am glad that I listened to my inner voice to run and not stop. Who knows if he would have hurt me or not, but I am very glad to know that God planted that in my brain. I believe that He talks to us. It may not be an audible voice that we can hear, but He does put thoughts in our minds. A group of 5 of us were walking in a big patch of woods behind my aunt's house when I was about 10. We used to like to go back there because back in the 80s, when I was a kid, parents would kick their kids out of the house for hours at a time. They'd say, "Go outside and play." My aunt was particularly mean about it. She would lock the door until she was ready to let us back in. We weren't supposed to go in the woods because the adults said it was dangerous, but we were kids and bored, so of course we went anyway. Well, this particular time, we went much further in than we normally did because we were bored with the area that was closest to the house. After a while, we came to this big clearing in the woods that was filled with furniture. There were couches and chairs all set up like a living room, and there was a trunk with clothing in it. Well, we thought that was just the coolest thing ever, so we all hang out there and pretended it was our house. After a little while of being there, we started hearing what sounded like someone walking around very close to the clearing. We got that eerie feeling that someone was out there watching us. We looked around and didn't see anyone, but we were spooked and decided to head back. Then we suddenly heard someone start whistling a tune, and it sounded like it was really close. Well, we freaked out and started running home. As we were running, we heard heavy footsteps gaining on us. At first they were walking, and then it sounded as if they were running to chase us. We were all terrified, screaming and crying. We burst out of the woods to my aunt's backyard and ran up and started frantically pounding on the door. It was still locked. We ran around the front, trying to get as far away from the woods as possible. My aunt wasn't answering the door and her car wasn't in the driveway. Now we were really terrified. Then suddenly from around the side of the house, my uncle jumped out and screamed, "Gotcha!" We all burst into tears. LOL. Apparently, they had tried to call us in a little while after we left, and when we weren't in the yard, my uncle went into the woods to look for us. He saw us from a distance sitting in the clearing and decided to mess with us. Needless to say, we never dared to go too far into the woods after that. I know my woods well. It's a large wood, with some parts deciduous and some parts pine. There are not usually many people in the woods, and if there are it's at times like weekends in nice weather, and they tend to stay on the main paths. I walk there a lot with my dogs, and if I spot too many people, I can easily turn off and reroute to a deserted, hidden path. I know the main paths, and a good number of small side paths, like the back of my hand, though there is occasionally one I've not spotted before and will explore. I know my bearings pretty well, as the woods is generally on a slope. I know what's at the top and what's at the bottom of that slope. In the main part of the woods, the path layout is basically one main path all around the edge, and 5 paths coming off that at various points, converging in the middle of that large circle, in a pretty clearing, which has a map and a picnic table in. There are other side paths, so if you know the layout of the other main paths, you usually have a good idea of roughly where you will emerge. There are other stretches of woods and more footpaths outside of that main ring, so the extent of woods overall is much further than this main area. As an idea of distance, you can walk fully around the outer ring path in about an hour, at a steady walk and chat pace. One evening, during the week, and heading into winter, my friend Gail and I took our dogs to the woods. We figured we had around 1.5 hours till it would get dark, plenty of time for a good walk. Our boys, the 2 Labradors Harry and Dennis, spend all of this time off the lead, sniffing around, chasing, jumping in puddles. They are generally like a couple of toddlers charged up on sweets, running around with sticks and poking stuff, exploring side paths but always coming back periodically to make sure that Mum is still nearby. Costa the Beagle has to stay on the lead, as the Beagle urge to follow her nose is just too strong, and she has been lost here before. So, Gail and I were strolling along, laughing at the boys and chatting. We were on a main path just off that central clearing within the outer ring path, when we spotted a new path that we'd not been on before. It was not particularly narrow or overgrown, it was a side path but a proper path. We decided to head down it and explore, which gave Harry the zoom eyes. He goes nuts when you take a new path. We all stood aside, and Dennis hid behind us, while Harry charged around like a nutter. More than one of us has been mown down before when Harry gets the zoom eyes, so we had to wait for him to calm down a bit. So, we went along this path. It was grassy underfoot, and in some places pretty muddy. There were logs crossing the path that we had to climb over. Being horsewomen, we rather thought it was like a cross-country track with a few nice log jumps thrown in, and indeed there were hoof prints along it. Well, this path was pretty winding but easy going. But then we realized that we had been walking on it for a good half hour, and by now the light was starting to fade. There had been no turn-offs on the path. There is no path within that outer ring that takes half an hour of easy walking, without emerging onto another path. But the path went on, and we were going across the slope, not up or down, so we should, in my head, have been hitting the outer path, by a long, high wall, after 15 to 20 minutes of taking the new path. This path went on, it was getting darker, and I was so sure of my bearings, yet there was no way this path could be so long. The feeling that we were lost was getting stronger, the night was closing in, and we were alone in the silent woods. At this point there was nothing we could do but keep going, because surely that would be quicker than going back. After nearly an hour, the path emerged onto a wider path, and we felt relief as we could then just head to that high wall, and down the path that followed it, back to our cars. We knew where we were again, but the dogs were blending into the shadows as the last of the light faded away. The creepy thing about this whole thing, was that my sense of direction was correct. We were heading in the direction of that big wall all along, and that's where we came out, but the path could not possibly have been so long. We were on it for an hour, yet that outer path around the edge of the woods took an hour all the way around. Here is a very rough map of the woods which I have drawn on the back of an envelope. I have since been back to my woods, those woods I know well. I have never been able to find that path again, despite looking for it. It should not have been hard to find, as it wasn't a narrow or hidden path and it had to be somewhere in the quadrant on the map, Quinn ran. I suppose we were engrossed in chatting when we took the path, and relieved to be somewhere familiar when we got off it, but I cannot for the life of me remember where the start or end of that path might be. The path seems to not exist anymore, and it was so long as to be impossibly long, knowing the area of the place that it had to fit within. "3 years ago, I went to Wales, Anglesey, and went for a walk in the woods nearby whilst my parents stayed in a little cottage overlooking the sea. I was walking through the woods when from a distance I encountered a very large dog and the owners were sat on a little bench that was close to a tree. And the dog could see me and I heard it start barking ferociously as soon as it saw me and I could see it edging forwards towards me, so I panicked and turned around and ran as fast as I could and ended up getting completely lost. It was a big forest. Upon running, I got tangled up in a nettle bush and got cuts all over me. My dress had ripped as well as my tights and I was in pain and bleeding. I couldn't get out of it and I could still hear that loud deafening barking. The dog's barking seemed to be getting louder. But the dog never ended up finding me. At this point, I was crying. I was so scared. I barely ever go anywhere alone without the company of someone, so I was terrified. I ended up getting out of that nettle bush to be greeted by my dad heading up in my direction. I couldn't tell you how thrilled I was to see him coming towards me. He came looking for me as I'd been out for such a long time. Just a little FYI. I had a massive phobia of dogs back then. So it made it all the more scary to me. Even a tiny little chihuahua would make me scream. Now, I adore dogs and they are absolutely everything to me. So if I was put in the same situation now, I don't think I'd have ran away. Although that dog was scary. It was some type of mastiff. It was huge and it seemed like it was in protective mode, understandably, as he was probably just protecting his owners. He may have thought I was a threat. Another scary encounter, that happened in the exact same woods about a few days after that one carrot. There was a mausoleum in the middle of the woods too, and I decided to pay a visit to it, yet again on my own. It was getting a bit late, around 5 p.m., but it was early September so it wasn't quite dark yet. And just from standing in front of it on my own with no one else around, just gave me the chills. I had a funny feeling from standing there. So, I didn't stick around. I quickly got myself out of there. The atmosphere surrounding it was eerie. Made me feel on edge. I spent a week backpacking alone in the Grand Tetons last year. It was the day of my 20th birthday when I was about halfway through the trail, which means I was the farthest point into the backcountry and miles from any civilization. That day I hiked farther into the day than normal to cover as much distance as I could. This was a mistake, because when I reached the designated permit campsite areas most were already taken. I continued on the trail before I reached something that kind of resembled a campsite. It was a small dirt area under a tree that sat adjacent to a tiny stream. I was uneasy about the spot, but it was getting too dark to find another one. I set up my tent and fell asleep alone in my small two-person tent right as the sun went down. A couple hours later, I woke to the sound of a twig snapping. I thought it was a squirrel or a marmot, so in a sleepy daze I hit the side of the tent to scare it off. Then there was a sound like something hit back. It frightened me, but I decided it must have been a branch or something that fell from the tree. I was still exhausted at that point and went back to sleep. Not long after I was woken by more twigs breaking, but this time they were noticeably steps and loud ones at that. I knew I was in bear country, but it was pitch black and I had the rain cover on and couldn't see anything. I hoped it was a deer and that it would wander off, and the sounds did stop. For a while. About 30 minutes later the same cracking sounds of twigs on the ground were moving the other direction. That's when it stopped and sniffed my tent. It had thunderous breaths and there was no doubt in my mind now that it was a bear. I had nowhere to run and all I had to defend myself with was a pocket knife and a can of bear spray. So I stayed up the rest of the night wide awake with both in my hands ready to defend myself. It stayed around my tent for 5 terrifying hours, infrequently walking, sniffing, and, at one point, scratching at my tent. It wasn't until the sun came up and the sound stopped that I had the courage to bolt out of my tent and as far away as I could get. When I looked back there was no sign of a bear, but when I finally returned to my campsite there were massive paw prints in the dirt surround it. It was the most terrifying night of my life.